Hello there, welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. Strange music show that dives into a different album each and every week, right? So we are, of course, returning to the randomizer, as you no doubt seen from the intro, which has churned out a suggestion by Significant Pepper. So on the video for Project Mycelium, Significant Pepper suggested a bunch of different albums to be reviewed, with the randomizer essentially spitting out the suggestion of this nearly 2-hour-long electronic breakcore album. So yeah, I'll be honest, this review has taken me ages to write. It's not the longest I've spent trying to write a review, but it was really difficult for me to approach for some reasons. Yeah, I found this one very difficult and not the most fun I've had reviewing something. However, the randomizer said we'd review it, and so we're going to go check it out basically. 22 tracks of IDM breakcore that ranges in length from just shy of 2 minutes to nearly 16 and a half minutes. And yes, for some reason I decided to discuss each and every single track on this thing. Why? I don't know. So without further ado, I present Out Like a Candle, Shattered Talisman Topology by Describes the Music. So, normally I'd ask myself who Describes the Music is at this point, but doesn't matter how much I try to look into this because I cannot find that out. The only information we have about this artist is their Bandcamp page, which tells us they're from Austin, Texas, with 4 albums under their belt. The debut album of Level 99, released in March 16, 2018, which features just 5 tracks ranging in length from 7 minutes to nearly 19 minutes. And then this was followed up with All the Letters Are Crystal Carbon Soap Scud, Atropos Fording Poison Dart Frog, which was released on July 31st, 2018, featuring a slightly longer track listing. And then things get very weird, I have to say, because it was on February 2nd, 2024 that Describes the Music released Through a Peacock's Feather's Eye, and the album we're discussing today, Out Like a Candle, Shattered Talisman Topology, both of which saw the album and the tracks themselves becoming so much longer, it feels. So the only other thing we have in terms of identification for this is the tags on the albums themselves, which for all of the albums describe it as autistic, breakcore, electronic IDM, industrial, and Austin. The only other things that we have to go on. The only other thing actually is each and every Bandcamp page tells us when the album was recorded specifically. Giving me a sense that each and every one of these releases, they're kind of like a compilation of sorts based on audio experiments composed by Describes the Music, which was all made between the years of 2016 and 2023 essentially. Very weird, but to be fair, kind of interesting in its own right. So, I'll say here, as I've mentioned at the beginning, this was a very difficult album for me to sink my teeth into. This whole review is incredibly shaky, nonsensical, with the very first words I wrote down being the following paragraph that follows this one, outlining my apprehension of tackling something like this. So, I guess the review starts now? So, before diving into this one, I just wanted to make a comment or two prior to engaging into the process of diving into the music itself. This suggestion from Significant Pepper comes across as rather overwhelming to me. I don't know how this review will turn out, because I'll be honest, this album just seems to intimidate me before I've even approached it. Very lengthy album with tracks ranging as short as 1.5 minutes to nearly as long as 16.5 minutes. And I don't know what's in store, but this is going to be a difficult task for someone like myself to undertake. Especially with the album being so incredibly long in its sort of. I mean, it's not as long as some other things, but it's definitely long. However, the randomizer suggested it, therefore we're going to dive into it and discuss it, so yeah, let's find out what the hell is going on here. So opening up with 7 by 11 by 13. This is an immediately aggressive set of heavy beats thumping away with the clanging, resonating sounds of some sort of metal being banged around in the background. It creates a very uncomfortable vibe to start everything off with, this sense of aggression and terror, all in the space of just a few opening seconds essentially. The beats themselves, they feel so oddly programmed, teetering on these kind of breakcore blast beats of sorts, whilst also featuring this consistent beat that keeps it all moving. The percussive elements, they seem to dominate the scene though, with the more ambient sections being hidden away by the persistence of those electronic beats that are just entirely in the forefront. But as mentioned, hidden in the background, it is there, kind of creating these very distorted soundscapes that suggest worlds that we shouldn't be inhabiting or viewing at all. All in all, a rather short track to open everything up with that no doubt paves the way for what will be a rather dark, aggressive and challenging album experience. And so our next track of Zeno's Paradox. So at 9.5 minutes, we have a lot of time to spend here. And this one offers more of the same electronic style in the opening, these rather breakcore beats that establish the tempos from hell. Whilst in the background, you've got these ambient soundscape establishing the sort of characters of the scene essentially. Brief glimpses of the faces and places just flashing past our very vision. And as a result, this one kind of has that Aphex Twin vibe, I have to say, especially with how twisted and distorted those more ambient layers become. It's like machinery, telephones, mobiles, the internet and adverts on radio and television all being caught in amongst distortion effects of these very odd filters shifting the focus towards something that is much more terrifying, like something hiding behind the veil of everything essentially. And it continues like this for the entire length of the composition, throwing in these very warped, unusual experimental layers of electronic noises that break up the composition into these various movements, some even breaking down the very concept and structure entirely until it becomes this odd amalgamation of what it's even supposed to be. Broken and glitchy, very much like the album's cover suggests to us. And even the music itself just cannot hold itself together, and instead it's just falling apart at the very hands of all that experimentation occurring. I have to say, I find with so much happening across the course of the composition, it is one of those things that becomes almost impossible for someone like myself to discern each and every unique detail of, which I believe is something that's going to come across a lot in this review. I just have that feeling anyway. But I think that that kind of falls into that ebb and pull effect you get from any kind of music. Just to kind of try to explain it a little bit, I find that when listening to long music of sorts, of many different genres I'll say as well, my brain just drifts in and out, suddenly pulled away and suddenly distracted, back and forth between these two states as the music just continues, in this case, its never-ending onslaught of breakcore noise and beats essentially. And regardless of which state I find myself in, whether it's paying attention to the madness or just being pulled away from it all, I do find that to be oddly interesting, as it all just creates this very weird vibe that is constantly changing with each and every second. And as well, there's so many fascinating little movements embedded with it all, where it's all taken into weird directions that you didn't think it would ever end up, to be fair. Keeping all of that momentum going even when it falls apart into that spectacular deluge of broken down electronics and glitches. I have to say, it's probably perhaps one of my more favourite parts of the composition and the many different compositions as well, where the notes just all bend and twist apart. It just sounds very satisfying to me. And although part of me is just kind of getting completely lost within the very music itself, I do find those particular elements very fascinating when it all progresses. The variance in all of those tones, the brief instances of melody and the persistent beats, the intensifying of certain layers towards the end that just builds it all up to a very terrifying level. Wonderfully weird and fascinating, and I think, to be fair, this is a rather brilliant track that kind of establishes the true nature of the album following on from the sort of short opener, an ever-twisting kaleidoscope of glitchy electronics. So, track 3, we have Halberd and Pride Jester. Another shorter one for us here. So this one opens up with a prominent feature of very synthy drony layers, moving away from the kind of breakcore beats in favour of a much more ambient soundscape, and one that is incredibly ominous in the way the melody just shifts upwards and upwards before spinning right back down entirely, it feels, before it then starts all up again and just loops over and over like that. It creates for us this vibe that feels very anxious and uncertain, like perhaps we're being made fools of, large eyes surveying us and laughing at us with their twisted faces. And it kind of just breaks away from the more IDM elements of the previous tracks, giving us just ambience of sorts, I guess, creating this little moment of respite against the onslaught of glitchy beats, while still retaining that very unsettling and dark atmosphere that is permeating throughout the entire recording. Very fascinating, I think, and I actually quite like the menacing vibe that this one's presenting, I should say. With the lack of beats, this one feels very hypnotising as a result, which is why the sudden appearance of a breakdown towards the end of it, bashing and bashing away for a few moments, it comes across as a rather nasty surprise, pushing us further into that uncomfortable landscape. But feels very intentional, and I can appreciate the almost jump scares quality of it though, because the track suggests something entirely and then you just get that ending that just warps everything brilliantly. Very cool. Next, we have Ashet Dryad's DDT Rotor Synthesay. 10-minute track here. So this one has a very aggressive beat, just battering away while this clambering assortment of glitchy ambient soundscape begins, before we end up in this weird video game territory in the form of a melody that just suddenly appears out of nowhere, it feels. The beats are an absolute onslaught on this one, just completely devoid of any structure and form for the most part, and just interfering against the soundscapes established by all of those other instruments. It contributes to that very glitchy style that so much of the music is producing, this ever-changing experience that just fast forwards through all of the different levels that you're going through, past all of the various loading screens and into the bowels of the very computer system itself, annihilating nearly everything in its path, it feels. This one is oddly fascinating in its own right as well, especially when you get these very brief little moments that sound like detuned vocal tracks of sorts, like someone hidden inside the computer itself, the ghost in the machine perhaps, attempting to communicate as the electronics just break apart all around them. It is an unrelenting onslaught of beats and electronic drones that gives you very little respite, I have to say, only occasionally in the form of these brief little breakdowns that settle the sound down just for a few moments, only to bring it all back up with that strange melody once more. And those broken beats and the continually detuning and breaking of the soundscapes themselves is just so bizarre and weird. Like, it's kind of fascinating to me how easily describes the music is able to just create such a myriad of tones and sounds and their craft across the course of these longer tracks. They're such an onslaught, but they pull you into these strange sound worlds and they just never let you go as they continue to assault across these really long lengths of time. I do find it interesting, even though there's a part of me feeling this kind of very nervous and anxious energy, which is perhaps because of my apprehension for approaching an album like this, as mentioned in the beginning, but also as a result of how the music is literally sounding as well. Like, this one in particular kind of gets to all those has such darkness. Like, so many of the tracks have this sort of darkness and glitchy elements of these horrors buried in amongst them, and it just makes it so uncomfortable as it just gets under your skin entirely. Though I feel like this one kind of manages to achieve levels of positivity at times, but maybe it's only in context of having heard the horror of everything prior. However, this one never seems to end though. Like roughly 5 minutes in, this one does all seem to fade into silence, leaving a brief pause before we're led into the second half of the track. And here it just turns up the glitchy elements even more so. The melody no longer able to occur in amongst the loops, vocals and phrases trapped in the recesses of the effects here. Unable to communicate anything tangible, as the beats just continue all of that pushing, all of that drive that is pulling us along this entire way. It's a weird composition, but as weird as I find it, I can't help but imagine describes the music, having so much fun here, just programming all of those beats and effects to create these long tracks that pull us along constantly. And to keep up this level of energy and drive across a long form track is very fascinating and impressive. And the kind of dark energy that is saturating all of these recordings is wonderful as well. Especially when you kind of get embedded in amongst the compositions, these oddly jollier moments, I guess you can call them, especially towards the end of this one, where the vocals, they feel much more prominent, these samples, choruses of what I'm going to assume is like pop media, I would assume, but I don't know, it could actually be anything at all. It could even be described as the music singing themselves, perhaps. But what is fascinating is the utilization in the creation of this very unsettling, unnatural, glitchy electronic computer world. No time to pause and think, and you just have to strap in and keep going as it pushes further and further and further. Moving swiftly along though, we do arrive at the album's longest track, 4 Flowers from the Magister's Garden. So this one opens up with a kind of baroque little melody introducing itself, before it's immediately thrown askew, caught in these unusual effects that pull weird squelchy tones out of it, and these unusual beats, once again, pushing it all along. There's kind of persistence to the melody that plays around this one, which feels a little bit whimsical, but I also can't ignore once again the kind of dark undercurrent riding throughout it all. Like much of the album thus far, this one once again captures that another pull and ebb effect between the two constant states, in this case the constantly broken up beats, some rapid, some persistent, against these very unusual tones being the other side of it, that create the very characters of the backdrop of the image, providing that constantly ascending, provided by that constantly ascending melody, essentially. But that is until this one all seems to taper off for a bit after a while, to let the beats take centre stage for a few moments. I find the whole thing to be very oddly bewildering though. It's like for me, I've booted up a video game of sorts that is constantly threatening to crash the computer. For the most part, anyway. And it all plays pretty well, but odd little glitches and interference just rear their head constantly, distorting the image and creating this scene that was never intended by the game's developers, perhaps. It's perhaps why there is such an unusual and unsettling element to so much of the music, actually. It's all just proceeding along, with the sense of things not being quite what they seem, and that there is something hidden well beneath the layers of electronic instrumentation. Shadows and figures, hiding in the very distance, emerging only when the scene has become distorted enough by the effects of all of those odd unusual glitches. It does make the experience very interesting though, and it interests me with it being very long gargantuan, especially in context of this particular track. It ends up, for me, just all regressing into the background, my attention is just overwhelmed by this point and the music just falls back basically. But you're still pushed along for the ride by these whimsical and sinister note tones. Once again, there's a lot of fun being had by the scribes of the music, who seems to be marvelling in the many effects and tones their electronics are creating, just abstractly exploring these freeform soundscapes that loop over and over, affected by the slightest tweaks here and there. It once again contributes that constantly changing atmosphere that is never once sitting still for a moment. Always on the move, always morphing and changing, while still retaining the core characteristics that make up the very album itself. Like some of the tracks, you do get a change on this one though. Roughly 7.5 minutes in, that strange melody is suddenly overtaken by the emergence of this rather sudden little beat, throwing it all into this very cautious, panicked area, before that too tapers off, leaving the composition struggling to sort of find itself once more. It's like it's all just fallen apart in this deluge of broken down electronics, with weirder loops going over and over the top of it all. Like we've fallen out of the level design and into the weird open world below of the, outside of the level space, essentially. Falling forever and ever, it seems. It's almost a dramatic change to the scene, but it's still one that creates so much of that rather unsettling, whimsical attitude once again. There's a stillness to this whole thing that cannot easily be ignored. And once again, you find yourself just strapped in for the ride, just pushed along by the entire whole thing. So, another point that I feel is worth mentioning, and mentioning at this point in particular because this is where my thought came up for it. But I find music like this, for me, it kind of acts like ambient music in some senses in a weird way. Bear with me here. With so much happening, and it all just constantly changing, I find my attention is constantly wavering along with the composition itself. At times, I am pulled by the occurring soundscapes and beats, given very vivid cartoon imagery as all progresses. Whilst at other times, the rather overwhelming nature has kind of pushed the music itself just entirely into the background. Weirdly enough though, it is kind of enjoyable when it occupies that space, as it just ends creating this constantly occurring music that feels very motivating in some respects, Easy to have on while you just get on with, something else, it seems. And this is kind of happens when I listen to long-form ambient compositions. I'll say I much prefer listening to long-form ambient compositions. I think when it comes to things being beats, my attention isn't held as concretely as when I'm listening to drones, because with drone music, I find I can really get lost within the textures of all the music playing. But I'm very well aware that for some people, beats and stuff and loads of beats is a much more interesting and fascinating thing for them. But to go back to it though, I feel like like ambient compositions, the music just ends up occurring irrespective of my own attentiveness. Or attentiveness, I don't know how you say the word, sorry. Similarly here, the same effect seems to be happening. Which I find to be rather remarkable. But it's maybe the intention of music like this, with it being so big and grand in scale. I wonder how easy is it to properly pay attention to each and every single detail of when it all occurs, especially with there being so many of them with every song, right? Interestingly, I think this is a point that is actually relevant to Tech Dog 1-7 by Patricia Taxon, and something that will come up if we ever get around to reviewing that one. An album that is so large in scale that it's also impossible to pay attention to all of its incredibly many details, especially as that one just grows larger and larger with each and every minute that passes. I don't know if it's a bad thing, but it is an observation about my experience of the music itself, hence why I thought it was worth mentioning here. What ends up happening as a result when I listen to music like this, I sort of feel thoughts and feelings and find myself moving on to the next thing as the music just continues all around me, It just becomes part of that odd background filter before eventually, after a while, my attention is captured again in the form of some weird musical motif or effect, most likely. And it occurs so much here on this album, though. The music just pulling me in and out, as it's all occurring, irrespective of my ability to keep up and pay attention to it. But even when that attention has waned, though, I find myself kind of enjoying what is occurring, if that makes sense. Like, an unsettling and sinister as a lot of the elements on this album are, the music itself is just fairly enjoyable and easy to get along with. Something that is great to accompany concentrated work, I would feel. Like, if I was doing my homework, for example, if I was back at school, I was doing homework and I was listening to something like this, I would find it very motivating indeed. In this context, I'm not doing that though. Like, when writing all of this review, I'm sitting down and paying attention to the music to try to write about it. And that is not as fun, I have to say, because it's not occupying the background. I'm trying to focus in on it, and it's a lot more difficult to actually enjoy. But it's just my experience of it. It's perhaps the flaw of actually writing this way and presenting things this way. Like, it doesn't work every time, does it? And this is definitely going to come up later in this review, I think, but it's oddly interesting. But yeah, I think for some people, they definitely enjoy this because, or would enjoy this because of how it can accompany your concentrated work. Then again, it's hard to say what people enjoy about this album because actually nobody on the internet seems to have an opinion about it, which is fine, right? It just sucks that at this current point in time, this is the only existing opinion on this album, it seems, because there's no reviews on it on like Rate Your Music or Discogs or anything, not even any Bandcamp reviews on it either. There's nothing there, so not helpful in the slightest at all, is it though? Because this is an incredibly flawed review, isn't it? But what can you do? This is just the first that has come out. But maybe as a result of this video, some people are going to go check out this album and come up with some other opinions on it, which will be much more interesting than anything I have to say about it. Moving along though, because I am reviewing this album and I'm going to get through every single song. We move on to the next track of The Only Thread Left, The Torturer Covets, This Clairvoyance Blind Light the Shadows of My Tomb. Bit of a mouthful. So this one has a much slower beat establishing itself, against a backdrop of glitchy warped electronics once more. I found myself kind of nodding along to this one, thrown off whenever after a few loops over and over, because it kind of just throws itself into abstraction, a brief breakdown as everything just shatters apart before being reassembled into the semblance of the composition itself, pushed along by sort of tinnier, more high-frequency beats, I think. Very strange soundscape that has this almost staccato style occurring alongside it. Most thanks to the kind of sudden appearance of a synth layer, I think, but I don't really know for sure. But it's definitely interesting nonetheless. But this one is kind of fun, I think, though. Just progressing along, changing things subtly before throwing it all into abstraction for these few brief moments. The breakdowns occur with a kind of frustrated energy, just devolving everything that has fallen and throwing it into this washing machine, letting it all collide and beat against each other as that faint melody attempts to play through the onslaught, still occurring even as the beats become much more of an interrupting factor here. Another amorphous blob of an audio experience that is constantly shifting and changing as it all occurs. Especially when a little over midway through, you've got this persistent high-pitched beat that occurs, rising and rising in pitch as it just drags the composition further and further into the realms of pure abstraction, of strange imagery that is constantly changing the more everything is all occurring. Very peculiar, and it creates for me this odd, fascinating portion of the composition that does demand my attention, pulling me back into what is occurring in the music itself, before it all recedes away and just lets my mind wander off once more. Weirdly enough, more tangents as it seems, as this seems to be the best way to write and structure this review, just to follow those tangents, following the strange threads of thoughts that occur as a result of listening to this album. But anyway, listening to this particular album, it kind of reminded me a little bit of sitting back and watching the old Windows Media Player visualizer. This is one of the reasons why I asked best friend and band leader Chad Murray of Burden Limbs to create a visualizer to go alongside this episode, actually, because I was reminded so much of the early 2000s Windows Media Player visualizer that you would have when listening to music. I have a lot of memories of listening to the likes of Linkin Park on very shitty computer speakers, marveling in the randomization of the Windows Media Player visualizer, I have to say. I think for me, it's the kind of glitchy randomness that that particular visualizer offered is why the music reminds me a little bit of that in some respects. This odd kaleidoscope of shape and colours constantly occurring. And I think as a result of the ever-shifting nature of this music, the way it's untethered and always allows to morph into the next thing, it just reminds me of it. Don't know if that's interesting, but another one of those weird threads that this particular review is going to create as we try to dive into it all. Let's move along though. The next track of DTHMLIHVD, the album's second longest track at just shy of 14 minutes. This one immediately opens up with such a sudden tense setting. Notes caught in effects, just sliding in and around the various channels of the headphones, rising and falling in volume, filling the space with this swirling miasma of just pure tension. It occupies the scene for a considerable time, falling into obscurity as its own details become blurred and distorted, with only brief instances breaking through to form the picture itself. But there's some nice randomization of effects here and there, creating that shifting experience once more. The whole of which is just caught in the constantly staggered effect of stopping and starting, it seems. It comes across to me as one of the more disorientating tracks that we've heard thus far, one that seems to just completely confuse you as a listener with this very esoteric experimentalism, even when the compositions becomes arguably easier to listen to when it's thrown into these more minimal sounding effects, thrown down the far end of the hallway as you navigate backwards through the rooms themselves, leaving the source of the sound behind as you push further and further away from it. It even gives room for these very ominous growls and rumbles of dense electronics, all the while that same looping melody still playing from between the walls themselves. And I'm kind of reminded of those weird video games when you're exploring liminal spaces. All the while, you can hear the sounds getting quieter and quieter as you find yourself within its vicinity. A Lovecraftian horror situated between the very shadows themselves. Very neat stuff, and I like what Describes the Music has done with the presentation of this one. By shrouding so much of this in this kind of dampening effect, it feels like it's all getting lost within itself, unable to present itself as a tangible form to us, essentially, with only the faintest of minute details coming through at various parts, be it the sampling of voices, the quiet melody caught within that deluge of effects though. very strange, but I like how arguably this one throws it all towards a more minimalist context, contrasting it against the more breakbeat styles of all of the other tracks that we've heard thus far, or most of them anyway. But still in keeping with that electronic style, of course, by utilising constantly occurring looped layers, where there's just these rather subtle manipulations that make it a much different character for what you've had on this album thus far. Of course, it does find many different places to go though. Midway through, or roughly anyway, there's an occurrence of very soft beats just rapidly playing over one another in a rather satisfying way, like they're unfolding across the scene itself, whilst this echoing effect of the melody occurs, throwing down hallways and wind tunnels. Like there's still places where it becomes intense as you continue to spin around in place over and over, rising in volume to briefly attack you as it just rushes past in a brief instant, leaving you confused and disorientated as it regresses back towards that muffled sound once more. It even finds time for another melody of sorts though, caught in a deluge of glitched effects that further emphasise that kind of starting and stopping effect, just keeping that momentum going in this very staggered form that seems to just constantly be tripping over itself. But I like what's going on here as a result though, because it's very strange and ominous, but I think there's something rather delightful about how it's all being presented. This kind of like once beautiful thing now completely destroyed by the effects of all this broken machinery, distorted and twisted into this horrifying image that barely rears its head, instead just opting to briefly drop in as it spins around and around. It is without a doubt one of the most disorientating tracks we've had on this album, which is odd as it feels sonically so different to what we have had thus far. Then again, there's 22 tracks on this thing and this is only track 7, but in the past 4 tracks we've heard, we have been experiencing the longest ones. Which is a good point to mention it here as well. The structuring of this album is very bizarre in that you've got a lot of the longer tracks sort of in the first half of the album, or even the first third of the album, I think you could say, before it then just runs off into a lot of these shorter tracks towards the end. But it's interesting because as a result of hearing all of the longest ones first, we're kind of getting all the biggest characters of this entire album experience. Hence why I think they feel so overwhelming and rather over the top. But it is interesting nonetheless, this constant occurrence of electronic IGM. Here though, kind of pulling it all into the realms of sort of experimental chill-out vibes that still retain a very threatening attitude throughout its entire runtime, makes for something that really mixes up the scene rather nicely while still tying into the entire aesthetic of the album. Very cool, and I think my favourite from this album thus far. So here we move into those shorter tracks as mentioned, starting with Vizier's Mirror Game, or Vizier's Mirror Game? I don't know how you say Vizier or Visor. So this one has a sort of intense and dense notes that come in, very video game aesthetic, as in the background you've got this weird bouncing melody playing. There's some nice effects in amongst the whole thing, and it once again just pulls us into strange liminal spaces where you're not sure of where the hell you're going or what is going on. But this one constantly feels like climbing and falling down, going up and down, falling back and forth again. A side-scroll, but also like a side-scrolling video games of old Mario on the Game Boy perhaps, culminating in a boss fight towards the very end. It's a short little excursion nonetheless, one that further pushes the confusing esoteric imagery that the album has been painting. And after the longer tracks have somewhat had this has an element of respite in that we can just chill out and get our bearings for a minute, whilst also still being bombarded by such a weird assortment of sounds, right? So then we move along to strange properties of stacked chairs. So this one kind of brings us back to the Aphex Twin style of things, a very intense beat that kind of has that jungle vibe, a snare in the background whilst you've got this weird melody pushing the strange imagery all around you. And as it plays, you kind of just start to nod your head along, and it just becomes a bit of a mesmerising track that seems to loop over and over. It just pushed along by that persistent tempo, essentially. What becomes evident after a couple of goes around is that there's this very weird effect hidden behind it all though, this warped sound accompanying those beats, and just when you think you're going to hone in on it and figure out what's occurring and what's happening there, the composition just drops into this weird little bridge that changes everything up entirely, like pulling the rug right out from beneath you. Once again, there is an incredibly playful vibe to this one. No evidence of describes the music having so much fun composing their music, sat behind their computer, marveling in the strange effects that music composition can conjure up, essentially. Like, it is evident on so many of the songs, which does make a lot of them come across as, very improvisational, of course, which I think nobody doubted here. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it at all. Like, I think what ends up happening, though, is you've got a lot of cool ideas that do come through the woodwork as a result of all of this weird improvisation experimentation, of twisting the knobs around and the buttons and forcing the music down unexpected avenues, though. It feels though, to get those particular modes to stand out though, they do need to be embedded in amongst many repeated loops and bars, as they kind of break up that structuring and stand out as a result of doing so, if that makes sense. And it creates for us as listeners, constantly changing compositions as mentioned. Like, all the songs seem to navigate whatever routes they see fit, and it results in very unusual yet oddly interesting music. Weirdly enough though, I find that when it comes to this particular track, the more it goes on, the less I have to say about it. And I find the nature of the music being exactly like this, as mentioned, of it being breakcore IDM full of beats and constant beats and stuff, my attention is just unable to hold onto itself for all that much, and pay attention to all the particulars of it. And I just find myself sort of sitting there letting it occur and drift past. It's interesting because I think this is probably the point where the album might be growing a little bit tiresome for me, which is a very cruel thing to say, but it is just part of my experience of it though. Because we've listened to so much of this album thus far, and there's still so much to go though, like, it's more difficult for me to sort of continue my enthusiasm about it. But it is what it is, of course, because it's just one of those things. But I felt with this one, this is where my attention really started to wane significantly, because I just had very little to say about it the more it all went along. But still, I decided to write this one by reviewing every single track though, and we're going to keep going because we're, well, not halfway. I mean, you can kind of say that we're halfway because we've gone through all the longer tracks, but yeah, we're going to keep going. So our next track is Echo Jester System, Bad Ideas About a Diving Helm. And this one, you've got a sort of legible vocal sample on this one discussing the stacking of chairs, which is the name of the previous track. Right, so what is going on here? Now, I wonder if this is intentional or a mistake, but it feels like the tracks maybe have been misnamed here by accident. That this should have been the name of the previous track, especially if it's talking about the stacking of chairs. But maybe this is a little trick being played upon us as listeners, by Describes the Music. Maybe this is the aforementioned jesters coming through and just playing jokes on us throughout the entirety of this runtime of the album. I have no idea, and I'm not going to bother trying to figure it out because it seems pointless to do so. But in any case, as a result of its vocal sample, this is a much more interesting track on the album, as it gives us something tangible to follow along to, as you're given such a weird electronic ambient soundscape to accompany it, one that seems to delve into elements of lo-fi distortion from time to time. But before long, the monologue becomes so overwhelming, just a bombardment of words that become so incomprehensible, so much like the music itself. And I'm very confused because I don't know if it's intentional or if this is a genuine mistake on the composer's part. Especially when you're uploading things to Bandcamp though, and especially as well if you're the kind of person who names your tracks nonsense and untitled things and names them when you upload them to Bandcamp, it can be very easy to mix things up by accident, of course. But regardless of their intent, whether they meant to do it this way, whether they didn't mean to do it this way, this particular track is a much more interesting one. The one discussing chairs, I don't know what it's meant to be, if it's meant to be the last track, if it isn't, but it's definitely much more interesting than a lot of what we've had here. So yeah, weird stuff, but the naming of it certainly boggles my brain and twists it around and stuff, and so yeah, I think it's best to just move along. So next we get Jester's Shadow in the Widow's Locket. So this one kind of throws its electronic melody right into your face, accompanied by this weird percussive element like a single cymbal ride, just before we're then given a bombardment by a myriad of electronic effects. Like this one seems like it's tightening the screws in your very mind as it's all occurring, like some demonic jester just infiltrating your brain and taking over everything it can find. And this one takes itself into such weird places, really distorting its melody into such a weird bastardization of carousel effects, warping it into such terrifying figures that get right under your skin. It is such an onslaught, especially in terms of its melody, which seems become a randomization of keys and notes, just hitting them with your fists and just letting whatever happens, happens. Weird one for me to wrap my head around, but then again the whole album pretty much is. Like, it's also incredibly confusing and such a confounding album experience that just doesn't want to adhere to any conventional rules, even in terms of the genre it's offering. And for someone like myself, it is such an onslaught of music and tones that forces that incomprehensibility upon you as you try to listen to it, regardless of whether you can keep up with that. Like, I know I certainly can't. Like many of the preceding tracks, I find myself so overwhelmed by this point that I'm just tuning all of it out, just letting it occur as it offers those sinister and nasty vibes. But I think it's perhaps where the strength of the album might lie though, in its unrelenting vision across that entire runtime, and how it delves into such peculiar and uncomfortable vibes from how it all literally sounds. Everything is just so broken and distorted beyond belief, breaking away even from the conventions of experimental IDM music. Like Aphex Twin caught in a K-hole perhaps. Weird but incomprehensible. Right. We still have a long way to go. Looking at the time now, we have come a long way, but we still have so much longer. I have no idea how long this is going to be. We'll find out when it's all finished editing, right? Next track, Lash Arts Trilogy. So this is a short one, opening up with very dense, chunky electronic tones, a bouncing assortment of notes running up and down, landing on either side of the piano keys almost before being broken up by these intense jungle beats once more, interrupted by the dissonant speech of interference it feels. This one seems to just pound you over the head as it all occurs, just continually bashing you away as it plays that demented melody, offset by really broken down glitchy beats. There's a kind of cool pause midway through this one where the beats falter away, leaving room for this really weirdly stretched out distorted version of that melody to play on. Like it's been flattened like a pancake, barely occurring in this small space within the song, before we're then greeted by another onslaught of beats. Mostly just beats, bordering on gabber at times, I think maybe anyway? But it comes across as another playful, if rather aggressive track, one that is further continuing this constant spiral down the plug hole into the brokey, glitchy electronic world. And then we get Dark Lust Epistemology. So this one, classic contrast again of the very weird beats, very Aphex Twin in terms of unusual sound design, as you've got twisted, glitchy and distorted electronics acting alongside it, pushing along with very unusual peculiarities. With this one, it's kind of like a constant hammering effect is occurring, repeatedly hitting the nail over and over and over, but never embedding it into the wood, which is just broken up by these very unusual and rather creepy passages of experimental sound design. But still, that constantly occurring beat continues to persist, only towards the end, accompanied by such a rising distortion of what I think is kind of like a wind effect in both of the headphones, essentially. Very short one here, which after the onslaught of long, overwhelming, bombarding experience we've had on this album is a very welcome change, I have to say, though not one that changes the vibe all that much, still just continue to present the constantly sinister edge present in all of these recordings. And so then we move on to Dart's Lance Centrifuge. Maybe continuing on from the last track with the sort of darts thing, I don't know. There's a lot of jesters, there's a lot of darts it feels. This one though has a very peculiar opening, like a broken industrial beat, like the machine is faulty, yet still pushing shit out onto the conveyor belt, as it's then accompanied by these very ethereal ambient layers. The persistence of the beat creates this kind of ominous sense lurking behind it all, whilst the more ambient side of things adds a much more character to it, I have to say, an establishing of this odd otherworldly scene it seems. And as it continues to progress, it of course switches the vibe up here with those intermittent glitches. Some brief, others threatening to pull it all into an entirely different area entirely and just going back and forth between it all. And I find myself with this one being very much kept on my toes, as the more it progresses, the stranger and more incomprehensible it's all becoming, as it starts to allow the glitchy beats to really take over the composition more and more. Like, everything is starting to glitch out and unable to really present itself, present the full picture anymore. Like broken software, a cracked computer screen, just interference all around you. And for the most part, I find this one to be oddly enjoyable. Like, so much of the album has been this persistent onslaught of never-ending electronic music that as a whole is too gargantuan inside to really compartmentalize, especially into a review, right? However, there's a few moments that do seem to stand out in amongst the entire experience, and especially for me personally. And for me, this is one of them. Like, I find something about this particular track is rather interesting for some reason. I don't know why exactly, but I find it to be a lot more enjoyable than the vast majority of tracks we have heard thus far. Like, it still retains so many of the qualities that make up so much of the album experience of utilising those glitchy electronics and beats to create very sinister soundscapes. But I guess the particulars of the tones utilised in this one just stand out better for me. Maybe that's it? I don't know. Very peculiar. I mean, especially towards the end though, it actually just offers up though a very minimal sound palette, offset by the rushing past of all these characters before ending on complete silence for 30 seconds. Now, I don't know if the silence is intentional here, but it is here. And as a result of it being here, this produces a very odd effect. So we have listened to this in well over an hour of this album by this point, especially if you listen to every track one after the other. And this is one of the few moments of just complete silence for 30 seconds. And essentially what we have is a genuine moment of respite. A small moment for us to gather ourselves for a few seconds before following the bombardment of an onslaught of music we've heard thus far. It's weird because it kind of acts to me like a little brief moment that captures the kind of same thing you'd get if you were to flip over a vinyl midway through listening to a record, or flipping over a cassette if you're like myself and listen to cassettes essentially. But like I said, I don't know if it's actually intentional though. I don't know if Describes the Music has intentionally done things this way, but it is here, and as a result it creates something that actually occurs on this album that is different and interesting. It borders on this now. This is an unscripted part, but it borders on me now how bizarre it is that out of so much on this album, what is actually standing out to me most is this brief 30-second gap of silence. I think because it just offsets so much of what the album is, of just this IDM music, this breakcore music, this onslaught of stuff happening, and then to have the antithesis of it, silence, makes something very interesting. But as mentioned, I don't know if it's actually intentional or not. It might just be a complete accident, like completely unintentional. But it's done something as a result. And weird accidental shit like that, if it is accidental, is weirdly cool to me. I like it when stuff like that happens because it just creates a part of the experience that you wouldn't think. But to be fair, it's what I get from it being here. And I think actually as well, it's actually been very useful in helping someone like myself to actually navigate this very unusual album. Very weird, very weird. Moving on, we then get Cosmic Gavel Opalescent Hailstorm. Another short one. Kind of opening up with this otherworldly, regal aesthetic, I want to say. At least for a few brief moments before this deluded noise comes in along certain beats, throwing you unaware before you're bombarded by that onslaught of noise. And when it hits, it's like being thrown into the blender once again as everything happens all at once. Amazing, because as our shortest track here, this feels every bit as formidable and overwhelming as everything we have heard on this album thus far. A lot to take in, but kind of interesting as own right, as it just navigates its demented deluge of noise. Very weird. Right, so on to 1001 Names. So this one brings us back to the glitchy breakcore aesthetics once again. much of what we have had thus far. The established electronic beats broken up by constant interference and bastardization from the composer, of course, isn't it? This one has a nice low end that actually makes an appearance on this one, kind of just throwing it all into uncertainty and caution. And it seems to just plod along, playing this loop over and over, just assaulting with these very dense, intimidating effects here and there. But I have to say, we're so far into this album that it's once again really hard for me to comprehend by this point. Like, all I can go on is the vibe that the music is presenting when it's occupying the background of my attention. And with this one, you've got this constant foreboding darkness that actually feels very mischievous. Weird, but it might actually just be the point though, because I'm just so wholly overwhelmed and intimidated by the entire experience. And it's hard for me to really know what's going on, because I've listened to so much of it by this point, but I don't feel like I understand much of it, if that makes any sense. Which is not a good thing for a viewer to be saying, but I'd rather be honest than to say it. Like, these reviews are about my experience of what I am listening to. But yeah, it's just so bizarre though, because it's not the kind of thing I can comfortably delve into, because in my mind there's just so much happening that's constantly changing. New glitches, different breaks, just a complete destruction of everything. And so much has happened across the length of this entire thing that by this point I just feel like I'm beaten into submission. And all I'm just doing is just letting it occur while I play video games, essentially. Except the software has become incredibly corrupted, and thus playing the game properly is now an impossibility by this point. There's no way to really get anything done though, because you're kind of just forcing the game to behave as you input the controls, watching the screen just fall apart into this glitchy spectacle, like the inner workings of a computer system throwing its electrical currents around the circuitry, interrupted by so many broken down chips and connections, resulting in something that can never sit still and is always progressing forward in such a staggered and broken manner. But I think it's kind of neat though, a rather fascinating spectacle in its own right. Even though I'm so battered and bruised by this point. Still, it's just what an album like this is like. It's very long, there's a lot going on, and there is still some ways to go as well. But let's move on. Eavesdropping on a Silent Planet. Now this one's kind of weird. This one has very weird beats pushing it along. The instrumental sounding very strange and stretched, like this tiny little melody being pushed out over and over while the beats attempt to form the semblance of the composition. And the whole vibe on this one feels very delightfully weird, like we've happened upon some kind of otherworldly place that we were never meant to see, of course. An alien society moving along at their own pace. And there's some nicely weird parts to this one though, opting to drone away on certain instances, as well as take all of the instrumental sounds and just contort it into this kaleidoscopic vision of absurdity. Weird because you almost become hypnotized and lulled by it, thrown off by the brief instances of what sounds like alien voices talking to you as your head just spins out of control, only to be suddenly thrown back towards the weird established scene of all of those beats. An odd one, but I kind of like the characters that have been presented here. Like it brief, but it's kind of cool. So next we get All in Your Head. So this one has a bit of a charming opener, or at least charming in context of this album, right? Kind of a moment of respite following those challenging moments once more. The absurdities of experimentalism as it just presents this nice enjoyable beat as the electronics just clamber around the place, like some sort of video game music once more. There's a bit of a calmer vibe to this one, still pushing forward a hurried tempo of sorts, but the energy seems to be a bit more relaxed here, opting for something a bit safer and easier to traverse, I would say. At times though, the scribes in music does do their typical thing of distorting it and changing the vibe before your very eyes, or ears I guess you would actually say, throwing it into areas of uncertainty as you wonder where the hell it is you're being dragged to. And before long though, all of those nice calming vibes, they seem to have broken down completely, the tempo being bastardized as it's all slowed down, manipulated by the disturbances of the computer's programming perhaps. Like you just end up getting a lot of beats just incessantly pushing down with no real tempo of sorts, just randomly occurring as the continued garbled noise occurs all around it essentially. Weird how this one seems dominated by the occurrence of that slightly odd sort of thunking sound towards the end. Less about melody and character and more about a sort of structure and form, or at least the breakdown of structure or form. Or maybe that's just my odd interpretation of the incomprehensible. In fact, the whole thing is just all in my head, isn't it? As they're suggesting. All in my head. Who knows at this point though? Like, it's so baffling and incomprehensible that it's impossible to really know exactly what to think, and my mind has been sent off so many weird avenues that I don't know. Let's move on. We get headless prefix Illuminatus. So a sudden shift right back to the breakcore style once more, the intensity of beat weighing down over these fervent instrumentals sitting so uncomfortably alongside it all. Everything here feels so thinly strung, so strewn across such a long length of time, taking the instances of each and every sound and just contorting it into these incredibly odd and unusual shapes. The composition itself just seems to follow no structure, just producing beats and weird little instrumental sounds that form no melody here, except a vague sense of one buried deep within the confines of the composition itself. Very weird, uncomfortable experience scene to sort of arrive at, especially after the onslaught of everything we've experienced thus far, but it's one that once again keeps in touch with the overall vibe and aesthetic of the albums, like so much of the tracks have been doing, to be fair. Like, in fairness to describe the music, as long of an onslaught this album is, it is consistent with keeping up all of those vibes. As a listener though, I do feel so completely overwhelmed and overloaded that all I can do is just sit here and let it occur. Just continue the journey as I find myself arriving at some very uncomfortable and disturbing locations. Especially when this one seems to break down the breakdowns and throw into these horrible levels of discordance and frequencies that ring in your ear essentially, like laser beams just firing all around you in an industrial complex. Sometimes hitting the machines that still force themselves to whir away as they continue those robotic functions, while sometimes the resulting explosions just cause further interference, resulting in this complete breakdown of form and structure as it's all occurring. Very uncomfortable. And although I'm so overwhelmed by the entire thing, a part of me is just kind of in awe over the entire thing. The fact that Describes the Music has created something of this magnitude. For myself, it's one of the most challenging releases I think I've actually come across. This whole album is so difficult for someone like myself to listen to, and not something I can easily listen to. But even though I'm so bombarded, overwhelmed, overloaded, there's something oddly fascinating about it as a result as well. Right, track 20, Hydra Suffix Illuminatus. So a dominance of this one by a very weird beat that's backed up by a much more fervent beat, before we then get into very nice bass tones coming in to push it all along further. There's a sense of chaos occurring here, like we're arriving at the final boss and engaging in that final fight, utilising all of our knowledge and resources in the final push towards the end. But there's some nice things going on with this one, though I do feel once again my attention span is so waning, so unable to keep up with the constant onslaught of just breakcore aesthetics. I think I might be one of those people, to be fair, that can handle this style in short bursts perhaps, instead of this incredibly long abstract version stretched out across this incredibly long runtime. I should say though, this is actually where curiosity hit me. I've listened to this album for so long, and yeah, I never spent any time looking how long it actually was. And what I did at this point on this song was I had to find out. So I took all of the track times and put them into a time calculator to see how long this album is, and it ended up informing me that this album is only 2 hours and 15 minutes in length. In the grand scheme of things, that's not so bad. Like we've reviewed albums much longer than that, like Door to the Darkness by Natural Snow Buildings, of course. Even The Disintegration Loops by William Basinski, all 4 CDs of that is much longer instead. But I think for someone like myself, enduring this style of music is something that I think is too long, or at least too long for someone like myself. I think this might just be a thing about how my brain is coded, perhaps, how it processes things. So I'll try my best to explain it. This is a very weird paragraph that goes in a bit of places, but like I said, this review has gone so many places, hasn't it? Essentially, when I get a form of music, where so much is happening all at once every second, just constantly shifting and changing, and never once sitting still, I find that really impossible to concentrate upon. It's like my specific brain chemistry can't follow along to it all, and instead prefers to spend time with long-form drone music where a singular sound instance occurs for similar lengths of times. Which is weird because I think a part of it makes no sense, but I think as well it's an interesting observation I've discovered about myself as a result of reviewing this particular album for this show. Like, it's not the kind of thing I would choose to sit down and listen to. It's simply the kind of thing my brain just doesn't easily engage in. But I can see the merits though, the draw of something like this. Certain brain chemistry functions better when listening to something like this, a constantly shifting experience. And this kind of reminds me of our bassist in Bird and Limbs, Ben Coombs actually, who very much seems to enjoy the sonic mad onslaughts of death grips. Who, when we were recording the band's second album, was playing a lot of the weird Death Grips compositions, such as Steroids, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Gabba Mega Mix, which is an absurd onslaught of 8 tracks mixed together, that which is such a just like overwhelming experience. The one that actually really piques my curiosity is one that I find impossible to properly sit down and listen to, but something I actually really want to try cover on the album at some cover on the show at some point. Gmail and the Restraining Orders. Like, I'm reminded of these completely different sounding albums because these albums occupy a similar place in my head, it feels, of being such a complete overload of sound that my brain cannot comprehend properly for even a second, it seems. And when it comes to this particular album, Out Like a Candle, Shattered Talisman Topology, I think a similar thing is occurring, all strictly within the confines of electronic breakcore music. It's just shifting and changing so much that I'm just completely overwhelmed and overloaded that I can't sit comfortably. But I wonder if this is perhaps the point, though, as I've mentioned previously, and an interesting sort of meta thing about actually trying to review music like this. The fact that I'm trying to sit down and comprehend everything that is occurring here so I can write about it, present about it, and at this point talk about it to you, the audience, now, I think is a detriment to enjoying an album like this, because what I should be doing is sitting back, letting it wash over, and therefore having a much better time. The fact that I'm trying to comprehend it and write about it is resulting in something that is very arduous as an experience, which is dumb because I've complained a lot in this review at various times, more so than I normally do. But I just think it's how it's a result of my understanding of why I'm being overwhelmed and how that's coming across in this one. Like, the irony is not lost on me. I think it's kind of funny, I have to say. But it's just weird though, because long albums, they don't bother me all that much though. Sometimes, but not always. It depends entirely on the album, of course. If it's something my brain can attach to, it's fine. But this album is just impenetrable to me, just my own personal experience of it. But at the same time, as overwhelmed and bombarded and confused and battered by it, I'm amazed at this whole album experience, Amazed at the work and effort that has gone into creating all of the many tracks here, though, consolidating it into this gargantuan experience. Like, it is vastly better than anything I could ever come up with, I feel. Like, I can never hold a candle to the music on Out Like a Candle, Shattered Talisman Topology. But then again, beats is never something I actually do in any of my music, to be fair, which is kind of funny as well, isn't it? But it is interesting. And I do see the merit in something like this, though. I can see that this being something that really appeals itself to a lot of people, but yeah, it is what it is. Moving along. We're nearly done talking about all the songs though, so we get our penultimate track, Jester Blue Shift Alt 6, including Coincidence in the Sideways Goat Room, which means God knows what. So this one sounds like a rave, with wonky, distorted, stretch, squelchy sounds occurring all around it. Like, if the last track that we just heard was final boss music, then this is the special bonus area that you'll get where the goats are spinning around in a circle for some reason, and Easter eggs are littered all over the walls while this techno gabba just blasts away for 4 minutes. have to say, this one's very amusing, and I actually find myself very entertained by this one. Especially as you get this weird bass tone in the background that just bounces around so weirdly and wildly. It's funny because you kind of get lost in that techno rave, but then it actually all tapers off, leaving room for this broken synth to just play this randomization of notes that come out from nowhere, backed up by a glorious drone that creates an even weirder vibe. I think there's something weirdly brilliant and amusing about listening to this one. It does kind of navigate back towards more breakcore musical moments at times, really relishing in those gloriously cool vibes as the beats come back and occur so sporadically but very intensely. And I think it actually makes for a fascinating track though. Something really cool about the fact that it's situated right at the end after this rather long, exhausting ordeal of an album experience. I think it might be the most I've enjoyed a track on this album. Maybe one of my favourites, but maybe because it's so different to all the other tracks, because it's just so weirdly dumb for the most part. It's just silly and goofy. But it is a nice little surprise to have at the end of this entire album. But yes, we actually do get one more track though, our final track of Meaning Trap featuring Sergeant Trill, a collaborative track to close off this entire thing. So this one has a weird vibe though when it starts, a kind of seesaw effect of odd sounds as we get this rattle of percussion, a triangle perhaps, before it just delves deep into this weird sort of swinging instrumental. And there's an intensity to it all, and it weighs down quite heavily as it all occurs, throwing in such odd occurrences of sound incidents the more it progresses along. For me, it kind of feels like a closing credits track. If this was the film, or even the video game perhaps, this is where you've just got all the actors and the developers and stuff going past in a blur, right? Flying past. With a special mention being given to the mysterious Sergeant Trill, when, the bit about the soundtrack comes up. As a track, it's a rather intense one, but it still continues the constant breakcore aesthetic that we're so used to by now, giving us one final gaze into the looking glass as it's bringing itself all to a close. I'm going to be honest, I don't really know what Sergeant Trill is doing here, because it doesn't seem all that much different to me, but they are here on this track, and they're along for the ride on this final experience, with it all ending on this very dense bass drone before the final beats get caught in a brief typhoon, thrown around for giving us the silence that follows the end. My goodness, what an onslaught this album has been. So I can see why I was a little apprehensive before approaching this one. This was a very difficult album for myself to digest, I think. But it has been a fascinating learning experience though. It's made me aware of the follies of producing a show like Weird Music, of attempting to sit down with music and articulate my thoughts about it. When I'm confronted with an album my brain cannot sit comfortably with, it becomes the garbled message you've experienced today. An overwhelming slew of incomprehensible thoughts. But I thought that was interesting, because it's my personal experience of this very album itself. It's weird though, because there's parts I did actually rather like about this album, but I think as a whole, because it's so big, there's so much happening, that it's so difficult for me to enjoy it as a whole. And rather, it's one of those things that I think is better for someone like myself to just drift in and out of and listen to little bits of whenever I feel the need to. It's weird. I think for some people though, this is the kind of music that's going to work very nicely as something you can just stick on and have occurring in the background whilst you do your homework or whatever else you do when listening to music like this. Listening to it, it does have that quality for me of being this constantly occurring thing that seems to recede into the background of your awareness as it's just playing all along, despite so much happening here. And certainly when writing this review, as you no doubt saw, there were so many moments where my attention just drifted off and I found myself mostly procrastinating, playing video games, which for me, while listening to it, was a lot more fun. The music accompanying the playing of games was much more fun than when I was trying to hone in upon it. I don't know the relevance of such a statement, but it's a fascinating occurrence I noticed as a result of my experience of this album, and therefore a part of this review because that is what was going on. This is my experience of this album. But overall, I do think it's an interesting album nonetheless. It's very intimidating, and it's not the kind of thing I would easily go for. Like, breakcore is grand for what it does, but it's not a genre of music that actually speaks to me in a resonating way for the most part. But I do think it's a very impressive album experience, the capacity to just dive into your own creative flow and produce so much of an array of music. Not just on this album, but on all of the albums by the Scribes and Music, it seems. Like, I'm in awe of how much there is here. Such a generous helping of electronic breakcore music as well, that is free for you to go and download, if you so wish. It's not the kind of thing I think I'm ever going to really return to, but it's not the kind of thing I hate, don't get me wrong. Like, so much of this show is about reviewing things that I love and enjoy, and that's why something like this was a bit more difficult, because I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it either. It's kind of just somewhere in the middle. The award for something I hated, that goes to Jingle Cats. I did not like reviewing that album, but I did have a lot of fun doing it so. But it was certainly a slog to get through. But then again, no, this one was also a bit of a slog as well, because it was so long, but I did enjoy it a lot more than some other things I have heard. Challenging onslaught of music that your attention span can just dip in and out of across 2-hour runtime. Go check it out if it's your thing. So yes, with that, I think we're finally at the end of our episode of Weird Music there. An incredibly long review. I think this might be one of the longest requested episode review, if you're not counting Daughters of Darkness by Natural Snow Buildings, which came prior to the randomizer. But yes, Out Like a Candle, Shattered Talisman Topology by Describes the Music. An unknown artist on the spectrum, operating in the electronic breakcore scene, making music probably for themselves, it feels. It seems someone who is just following their own creative muse, creating whatever seems right to them, which is a very admirable thing, because I have a lot of admiration for anyone who is making their own music. It might not communicate itself to absolutely everyone. I don't think it really fully communicated itself to me personally, but it no doubt will with some people, providing they can access it. So maybe some of you watching will get a lot out of this, or maybe more than I did. But I think Describes the Music, they should definitely be proud of their phenomenal and vast discography of music. Like, we're still no closer to ever understanding who they are or what their deal is. All we know is they like to make long, challenging electronic breakcore albums. So go check this one out if it piques your curiosity. And so yes, with that, I'd like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music, another randomizer episode. Yeah, the randomizer does certainly pick out weird things, doesn't it? But that is why I like it though, because we would never have a review about this if it wasn't for the randomizer to focus on the ADHD that makes me not pay attention to these things. Oh, for better or for worse, it does certainly help me as a person, but it does make some interesting episodes, and the episodes do seem to be popular amongst Weird Music canon actually, so yeah, definitely worth doing. So yeah, huge thanks to Significant Pepper for their suggestion. Definitely one of the more difficult things I've personally had to review, but that's just me. So yeah, once again, if you have any suggestions of your own, just throw them out there. I'll add them onto the wheel. We will see if we ever get around to reviewing it. You never know. It could happen next week, it could happen in a month or next year. For now though, I wish you all the best. I hope you take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.